James Park stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the snow fall gently over Seoul's glittering skyline on Christmas Eve. At 38, he had built a technology empire that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in South Korea, but success had come at a price that weighed heavily on his heart. His 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, was spending Christmas with her maternal grandparents, an arrangement that had become routine since his ex-wife had passed away 3 years ago. The custody agreement ensured Sophie had stability, but it left James alone during the holidays, surrounded by luxury but starved of the warmth that only family could provide. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had created technology designed to connect people, yet he felt more isolated than ever. His days were filled with board meetings, strategic decisions, and the constant pressure of maintaining his position at the top of a competitive industry. James had tried to fill the void with work, throwing himself into new projects and acquisitions with the same intensity that had built his fortune. But on nights like this, when the city celebrated while he stood alone in his pristine office, the emptiness felt overwhelming. His assistant had left hours ago, wishing him a Merry Christmas with the kind of polite concern that employees showed their workaholic bosses. The building was nearly empty, with only security guards and a few other souls who, like him, had nowhere else to be. As he prepared to leave for his equally empty penthouse apartment, James made a decision that would change everything. Instead of taking his usual route home in his chauffeured car, he would walk through the city streets, hoping that the cold air and the sight of families celebrating might somehow ease the ache in his chest. Capítulo 2. The Desperate Search. 3 blocks from James's gleaming office building, 24-year-old Min-ji crouched beside a dumpster behind a high-end restaurant, her breath visible in the frigid air as she carefully searched through discarded food containers. Her worn but clean coat provided little protection against the December cold, but she had learned to endure discomfort for the sake of survival. Min-ji's movements were methodical and practiced, the result of months of necessity that had taught her which restaurants threw away the least spoiled food and what times offered the best opportunities. She wasn't looking for herself. She had eaten earlier from a free meal program at a local church, but for someone far more important. Hidden in her small backpack was a thermos that she hoped to fill with something warm and nutritious. Every morsel she found was evaluated not for her own hunger, but for its suitability for someone with a delicate constitution who needed proper nutrition to survive. The shame of her situation burned almost as much as the cold. 6 months ago, she had been a university student with dreams of becoming a social worker, living in a small but comfortable apartment and believing that hard work would eventually lead to a stable life. Everything had changed when her younger brother had been diagnosed with leukemia. The medical bills had consumed their family's modest savings within weeks, and when their parents had died in a car accident while rushing to the hospital during one of his crisis episodes, Min-ji had found herself alone with a sick child and mounting debts. She had dropped out of university, sold everything of value, and taken any work she could find. But her brother's condition required constant care, making regular employment impossible. The government assistance was minimal, and private charity had waiting lists that stretched for months. Tonight, like every night, Min-ji's only thought was finding enough food to keep her brother alive until tomorrow. Capítulo 3. An Unexpected Encounter. James had been walking for 20 minutes, his expensive shoes crunching through the snow as he observed the contrast between the festive decorations and the harsh reality of winter poverty that existed in the shadows of prosperity. He had always known intellectually that such struggles existed, but his wealth had insulated him from witnessing them directly. As he passed an alley behind a row of upscale restaurants, a movement caught his eye. In the dim light cast by a street lamp, he saw a young woman crouched beside a dumpster, her actions careful and deliberate rather than frantic or desperate. James stopped, his business instincts telling him to keep walking while his conscience urged him to understand what he was witnessing. The woman appeared to be searching for food, but there was something about her demeanor that suggested this wasn't addiction or mental illness driving her actions. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with long, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her clothes were worn but clean, and despite her circumstances, she maintained a dignity that spoke of better times and careful upbringing. When she found a container that seemed to meet her criteria, she opened it carefully, smelled the contents, and then transferred a portion to a thermos she pulled from her backpack. The action was so tender, so purposeful, that James realized she wasn't feeding herself. Minji sensed she was being watched and looked up, her eyes meeting James's across the alley. For a moment, neither moved. She saw a well-dressed man in an expensive coat, someone who clearly belonged to a different world than the one she now inhabited. James saw exhaustion, determination, and something else in her eyes, a fierce protectiveness that reminded him of how he felt about his own daughter. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, taking a step closer. Capítulo 4. The Protective Instinct. Minji's first instinct was to run. Experience had taught her that encounters with wealthy strangers rarely ended well for people in her situation. They either offered pity that came with judgment, or they called security to remove the problem from their sight. But something in the man's voice stopped her. It wasn't the condescending tone she had grown accustomed to, nor was it the fearful disgust that some people showed when confronted with poverty. It sounded genuinely concerned, almost gentle. "I'm fine," she replied quietly, clutching her thermos protectively against her chest. The lie came easily. She had been telling it for months to social workers, church volunteers, and anyone else who asked questions she couldn't afford to answer honestly. James noticed how she held the thermos, the way her body language screamed protective instinct despite her vulnerable position. His own parental instincts, honed by years of worrying about Sophie, recognized the signs of someone caring for another person. "That's for someone else, isn't it?" he asked, nodding toward the thermos. "Someone who's waiting for you." Minji's eyes widened slightly. Most people assumed she was homeless and hungry herself. The fact that this stranger had immediately understood that she was caring for someone else caught her off guard. She nodded slowly, unsure why she was admitting anything to this man, but somehow unable to lie when he had seen the truth so clearly. "My brother," she said simply. He's sick." James felt something shift in his chest. The image of this young woman braving the cold and her own pride to care for a sick sibling resonated with his own fierce love for Sophie. "How sick?" he asked, and Minji heard something in his voice that made her look at him more carefully. Tata Capítulo 5. Revealing the Truth. Minji studied James's face in the dim streetlight, searching for signs of the judgment or false sympathy she had encountered so many times before. Instead, she saw something that looked like genuine concern, mixed with a pain that seemed familiar. "Leukemia," she said finally, the word hanging in the cold air between them. "He's only 16, and he needs treatments that we can't afford. The free clinic does what they can, but..." She trailed off, unable to voice the reality that her brother was slowly dying while she scrambled to keep him alive one day at a time. James felt his heart constrict. He thought of Sophie, healthy and safe with her grandparents, and couldn't imagine watching her suffer while being powerless to help. "How long has he been sick?" he asked, moving closer despite Minji's obvious discomfort with his proximity. 8 months, she replied. "Our parents died 6 months ago, and since then it's just been us. I try to work, but he needs constant care, and the treatments make him so weak." Her voice broke slightly, and James saw her struggle to maintain the composure that had probably been her only armor against a world that had shown her little kindness. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Minji," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Minji Choi." "I'm James Park," he said, and watched as recognition flickered in her eyes. His name was well known in Seoul's business circles, though he doubted she knew the full extent of his wealth. "You're the technology CEO," she said quietly. "I've seen you in the news." James nodded, then made a decision that would change both their lives. "Minji, I'd like to help you and your brother. Would you let me do that?" Capítulo 6. The Difficult Decision. Minji's immediate reaction was to refuse. She had learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true, especially from wealthy strangers who might have ulterior motives. Her experiences over the past months had taught her that help often came with strings attached that she couldn't afford to accept. "I don't need charity," she said, lifting her chin with a pride that impressed James even as it frustrated him. "We're managing." James looked at her thin frame, her worn clothes, and the thermos she clutched like a lifeline, and saw anything but someone who was managing. But he also recognized the dignity that was probably all she had left. "It's not charity," he said carefully. "It's one parent understanding what another caregiver is going through. I have a daughter, and I can't imagine watching her suffer while being unable to help." Something in his tone made Minji look at him more carefully. She saw past the expensive clothes and confident bearing to the pain in his eyes, the loneliness that seemed to mirror her own isolation. "Why would you want to help us?" she asked. "You don't even know us." James was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because 6 months ago, I would have walked past this alley without stopping. I would have been too busy, too focused on my own problems to notice someone else's pain. But losing people you love changes you. It makes you realize that we're all just trying to take care of the people who matter to us." Minji felt tears threatening, moved by his honesty and the recognition that this man understood loss in a way that most people didn't. "What kind of help?" she asked quietly, hating herself for even considering it, but knowing that her brother's life might depend on swallowing her pride. Capítulo 7. An unexpected proposal. James could see the internal struggle playing out on Minji's face. The battle between desperation and dignity that he suspected had been her constant companion for months. He chose his next words carefully, knowing that how he framed his offer would determine whether she accepted or disappeared into the night. "I need someone to help me with my daughter," he said, the idea forming as he spoke. "She's 7, and she spends a lot of time with her grandparents because my work schedule is demanding, but I want her to have more stability, someone who could be there when I can't be." It wasn't entirely true. Sophie was well cared for, but it wasn't entirely false either. James had been struggling with the balance between his responsibilities as a CEO and his desire to be more present in his daughter's life. "You want me to be a nanny?" Minji asked, confusion evident in her voice. "A companion, a caregiver, someone who understands what it means to put family first," James clarified. "The position would come with a salary that could cover your brother's medical expenses and housing that could accommodate both of you." Minji stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. It sounded too good to be true, which in her experience meant it probably was. "Why me?" she asked. "You could hire anyone. Someone with experience, references, proper credentials." James smiled slightly. "Because in the last 10 minutes, you've shown me more about dedication and love than I've seen in years of interviewing qualified candidates. You're risking your safety and your pride to take care of someone you love. That's exactly the kind of person I want around my daughter." Minji felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. The offer represented everything she had been praying for, but had stopped believing was possible. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course," James replied. "But Minji, your brother needs help now. Let me at least get him proper medical care while you decide about the rest." Capítulo 8. The Leap of Faith. Minji spent the rest of Christmas Eve sitting beside her brother's bed in their tiny, cold apartment, watching him sleep fitfully while she wrestled with James's offer. Jinwoo looked so young and fragile in the dim light, his 16-year-old frame reduced to skin and bones by months of inadequate treatment. She had told him about the encounter, watching his eyes light up with a hope she hadn't seen in months when she mentioned the possibility of proper medical care. But she had also seen his concern for her, his worry that she was sacrificing too much for his sake. "Nuna," he had whispered, using the affectionate term for older sister, "you don't have to take care of me anymore. Maybe it's time to let me go." The words had broken her heart because she knew they came from love, not despair. Jinwoo was trying to free her from the burden of his illness, not understanding that caring for him was the only thing giving her life meaning. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, Minji made her decision. She called the number James had given her, her hands shaking as she dialed. "I'll take the job," she said when he answered. "But I have conditions." "Name them," James replied, and she could hear the relief in his voice. "I want a contract that protects both Jinwoo and me. I want to meet your daughter before I agree to anything permanent, and I want to understand exactly what you expect from this arrangement." "Fair enough," James said. "Can I send a car to take Jinwoo to the hospital? I've already spoken with the best oncologist in Seoul, and he's agreed to see him today. Minji felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at her sleeping brother. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that they might both survive this nightmare. "Yes," she whispered. "Please, yes." Capítulo 9. Meeting Sophie. 3 days later, Minji found herself standing in the elegant foyer of James's penthouse apartment, nervously smoothing her new clothes. The first new outfit she had owned in over a year. James had insisted on providing appropriate attire for her new position, but she still felt like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Jin-woo was in the hospital, receiving the first round of proper treatment he had had since his diagnosis. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, and for the first time in months, his pain was being properly managed. Minji had spent every night sleeping in the chair beside his bed, afraid to leave him alone in the unfamiliar environment. "She's shy at first," James was saying as they waited for Sophie to come downstairs. "She's been through a lot with her mother's death, and she's protective of our family dynamic." Minji nodded, understanding the child's caution. She had been protective of Jin-woo in the same way, suspicious of anyone who tried to enter their small circle of two. When Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, Minji's breath caught. The little girl was beautiful, with her father's intelligent eyes and delicate features that spoke of her mixed heritage. But it was the wariness in her expression that Minji recognized most clearly. Sophie descended the stairs slowly, studying Minji with the careful assessment of a child who had learned not to trust easily. When she reached the bottom, she moved to stand close to her father, one small hand resting on his arm. "Sophie, this is Minji," James said gently. "She's going to be helping us for a while. Are you going to live here?" Sophie asked directly, her voice polite but guarded. "For a while," Minji replied honestly. "If that's okay with you." Sophie considered this, tilting her head slightly. "Do you have any brothers or sisters?" "I have a younger brother," Minji said. "He's sick, so I take care of him." Something shifted in Sophie's expression, a recognition of shared experience that surprised all three of them. Capítulo 10. Building Trust. Over the following weeks, Minji settled into a routine that felt surreal after months of uncertainty. Her days were divided between caring for Sophie and visiting Jin-woo at the hospital, where his condition was slowly but steadily improving under proper medical care. Sophie had initially maintained a polite distance, but Minji's genuine care and lack of pretense gradually won her over. The breakthrough came when Sophie found Minji crying quietly in the kitchen after a particularly difficult day at the hospital. "Is your brother going to die?" Sophie asked with the directness that only children possessed. Minji was startled by the question, but she saw genuine concern in the little girl's eyes. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "The doctors are helping him, but he's very sick." Sophie nodded solemnly. "My mom died when I was 4. I still miss her." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, broke something open in Minji's chest. She knelt down to Sophie's level and saw her own grief reflected in the child's eyes. "I miss my parents too," Minji said softly. "They died in a car accident. That's why you take care of your brother by yourself," Sophie said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Yes," Minji replied, "just like your dad takes care of you." From that moment, their relationship changed. Sophie began seeking Minji out, sharing stories about school and asking questions about Jin-woo. She drew pictures for him and insisted on helping Minji prepare special foods that might tempt his appetite. James watched this developing bond with amazement and something that felt dangerously close to contentment. His penthouse, which had felt like a beautiful but cold museum, was beginning to feel like a home. Capítulo 11. Unexpected Complications. 6 weeks into the arrangement, Minji's carefully constructed new life faced its first major challenge. Jin-woo's treatment was progressing well, but the emotional toll of their situation was beginning to manifest in unexpected ways. Sophie had become deeply attached to both Minji and the idea of Jin-woo, whom she had never met but considered part of their extended family. When Minji mentioned that Jin-woo might be able to leave the hospital soon, Sophie immediately assumed he would come live with them. But where else would he go? Sophie asked when James gently explained that the arrangement was more complex than that. The question hung in the air, highlighting the temporary nature of their situation that everyone had been avoiding discussing. Minji had been so focused on getting Jinwoo healthy that she hadn't fully considered what would happen next. James found himself in an unexpected position. What had begun as a practical solution to help someone in need had evolved into something that felt essential to his and Sophie's happiness. Minji had brought warmth and genuine care into their lives, and Sophie was thriving under her attention. But he was also aware that Minji might want to return to her own life once Jinwoo was well. She had mentioned her interrupted university studies and her dreams of becoming a social worker. He had no right to expect her to give up her aspirations to remain as their caregiver. The conversation came to a head one evening when Sophie was asleep, and James and Minji were reviewing Jinwoo's latest medical reports. "What happens when he's well enough to leave the hospital?" James asked quietly. Minji looked up from the papers, her expression troubled. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't let myself think that far ahead." "You could stay," James said, the words coming out more urgently than he had intended. "Both of you. This could be permanent if you want it to be." Capítulo 12. A new kind of family. Minji stared at James, trying to process what he was offering. Permanence was something she had stopped believing in months ago, when her world had collapsed around her. The idea that she could have stability, that Jinwoo could have ongoing medical care, that she could continue being part of Sophie's life, it seemed too good to be true. "Why?" she asked, echoing her question from that first night in the alley. "Why would you want us to stay?" James was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. Over the past weeks, he had watched Minji transform his daughter's life and his own. Sophie laughed more, worried less, and had begun to trust that the adults in her life would be there when she needed them. "Because you've given us something I didn't know we were missing," he said finally. "Sophie has never been happier, and I haven't felt this much like we were a real family since her mother died." Minji felt tears threatening again, but this time they weren't born of desperation or grief. They were tears of possibility, of hope for a future she had thought was lost forever. "What about Jinwoo?" she asked. "He's not your responsibility. He's your family, which makes him our family," James replied simply. "Sophie already considers him her brother. She's been planning his room and making lists of things to show him when he comes home." The word home hung between them, loaded with promise and possibility. 2 weeks later, Jinwoo was discharged from the hospital, his cancer in remission and his strength slowly returning. Minji brought him to the penthouse, where Sophie waited with barely contained excitement and a banner she had made herself that read, "Welcome home, Jinwoo." As Minji watched her brother's amazed expression as he took in his new surroundings and saw Sophie's proud smile as she showed him the room she had helped prepare, she realized that sometimes the most unexpected circumstances could lead to the most perfect outcome. Capítulo 13. Christmas Miracle. 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, Minji stood at the same floor-to-ceiling windows where James had stood when their lives first intersected. But now she wasn't alone. Sophie was beside her, pointing out the Christmas lights scattered across the city, while Jinwoo and James prepared hot chocolate in the kitchen. The past year had brought challenges and adjustments as they learned to function as an unconventional family. Minji had returned to university part-time, pursuing her social work degree with James's encouragement and financial support. Jinwoo had not only recovered his health, but had excelled in his new school, making friends and rediscovering the joy that his illness had stolen. Sophie had blossomed under the attention of her expanded family, her natural confidence returning as she felt secure in the knowledge that she was surrounded by people who would never leave her. James had discovered that success meant something entirely different when shared with people who loved him for who he was rather than what he could provide. His relationship with Minji had evolved slowly and naturally, from gratitude to friendship, to something deeper that neither of them had expected, but both treasured. "Do you remember what you were doing last Christmas Eve?" Sophie asked Minji, interrupting her thoughts. Minji smiled, thinking of that desperate young woman searching through garbage bins, driven by love and fear in equal measure. "I was looking for something," she said honestly. "Did you find it?" Sophie asked, with the curiosity that had become her trademark. Minji looked around at their warm, bright home filled with laughter and love, at Jinwoo healthy and happy, at James approaching with steaming mugs and a smile that was meant just for her. "Yes," she said, pulling Sophie closer. "I found everything I was looking for, even though I didn't know it at the time." Outside, snow began to fall again, just as it had that night when a desperate search for food had led to the discovery of family, hope, and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. Dear listeners, we hope this story about unexpected encounters, the power of compassion, and how love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances has touched your hearts. Minji and James's story reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments can lead to our greatest blessings, and that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who choose to love and care for each other. We'd love to know what country you're listening from and what you think about the power of kindness to change lives. Please share in the comments where you're joining us from today, and let us know if you believe that Christmas miracles can happen when we open our hearts to helping others. Your comments and support motivate us to keep bringing you these stories that celebrate the transformative power of love and human connection. Until our next story.